Susie and the Harness: Stories, Solutions, and Strategies for Safe, Satisfying Driving. This podcast is all about working animals in harness, from agriculture to pleasure driving to performance driving at the international level. Learn about what driving is, training tips, history, and more with each episode. I am your host, Corey E.R. Trout of CERT Horsemanship. This episode is going to discuss the difference between reacting and responding and why one is preferable over the other. In the simplest terms, and this is defined according to Corey, a reaction is an action that is taken after an event or sensation of some sort, and it comes from an instinctive place, often based on protecting one's self and survival. So another way to say that is you react to something without really thinking about it. It's just what you do. And it is not based on rational thought. A response, on the other hand, is an action that is taken after an event and comes from a place of conscious thought and understanding. So when you're responding to something, you've basically felt it, seen it, and have assessed what's going on, and you have a conscious and thoughtful response to what is going on or what has happened. I am sure everyone has seen an animal react negatively to a situation, and so I don't think I necessarily have to describe it, but in the case of carriage driving, typically we're using herbivores to do our pulling work. Of course, some people do use dogs for sledding and some other work, but in the carriage driving context, we're talking medium to large herbivores, so we'll go ahead and stick with that as we're discussing reacting and responding. A horse that is reacting is generally not using the problem-solving part of their brain, so they tend to be in survival mode. They're in fear for their life and their continued existence. They are reacting to their environment and attempting to get back into a state of safety and comfort, which in the case of horses is usually running away until whatever's scaring them is gone, right? An animal that is responding is actively engaged with its environment and is adapting to the situation in a more positive manner with a lot less stress. Mammals as a group have some basic instinctual responses to stressful situations. So the three that most people are familiar with are fight, flight, and freeze. Technically, there's a fourth one called fawning, which is appeasement behaviors, but the three major ones are fight, flight, and freeze. And I guess I don't necessarily need to describe these, but fighting is obviously fighting whatever's trying to kill you, whether it's aggressively going after it or even just batting it away or what have you. Flight is obviously running away. Freezing is being frozen in space. So it's still an action, but it's a lack of physical activity. So for most horses, you're going to get either freezing or flight because horses tend to solve their problems with their feet. They evolved in large open spaces, and running away was the best option, and they became very good at it. They will tend to run rather than freeze in place or fight when things do scare them. However, if they're in a situation where they can't run, some will freeze and then others will fight the containment, depending on the personality and prior experience with such situations. This is a little different when you get to donkeys and mules, because donkeys developed over the course of time in perilous footing. So think about rocky deserts, canyons, and mountains. And if you just run off, you're gonna have problems. Running without thinking in these environments could result in death, broken bones, other injuries, falling off a cliff. So donkeys, mules, and related are more likely to freeze and assess before they take action, whether it's fighting or flight. A donkey will want to pause and assess before bolting off or fighting, or deciding that, the threat wasn't actually a threat after all. This is also why some people prefer donkeys and mules over horses, because they're a little less prone to engage the flight reaction without warning. In my experience, this also applies somewhat to cattle. They tend to freeze before they hit the fight or flight response. I do have a very small working sample with oxen, but they also seem to have a little bit more of a tendency towards fight over flight as well. if they find something that's a little less threatening, they're going to try and just push through it rather than run away from it. The people that are familiar with working oxen can correct me if I'm wrong. I'm sure it depends on the individual too, just like some horses are more prone to go after a thing that they find offensive, and others are more likely to stop and stare at something. So mileage may vary depending on your individual animal. All three of these responses are reactions to stress and scary stuff. So basically, anytime the animal is concerned about its safety, it doesn't feel like it's a safe situation, they're worried about getting injured or killed, they're going to enter one of these three states. We don't want our animals reactionary. We want them responsive. We want them to respond in the manner we've trained them to in order to help them navigate any situation they might be in. You can have the best trained, most experienced animal, but there will always be something in the universe that will cause them concern. So it's not whether or not your animal's going to spook, it's how big and how long it takes you to convince them to listen to you afterwards. Any animal will have at least one thing in their life that scares them. So when they're scared, the goal is to have them looking to you. So again, the ideal is that they may have half a second of, what was that? Or they may, go sideways or do a step forward. But then when you come in there and say, you're fine, or it's nothing to worry about, you want to see them kind of go, oh, okay. Okay, good. And that's our goal. Our goal isn't that they never spook. It's that they check in with us as to whether they should be worried, and you can reassure them that there's nothing to fear, and then you can carry on with normal business. A responsive animal will be listening to all your signals, responsive to what is being asked, whether it is from your voice, lines, or the whip. It is important to note that we are working with herd animals, so they have this thought of safety in numbers. When you're driving, whether you've got an open or a closed bridle, you are physically removed from your animal. They might not be able to see you because we tend to sit behind them in their blind spot, and especially with a closed bridle because that blind spot becomes a lot bigger. And it might be harder for them to remember and realize that they aren't alone in what they're doing. So again, all you have to communicate with them is the bridle, whip, and the voice. And I find talking using that voice is very important. And that's for multiple reasons. One, they can hear you and know that you're there, but talking also means that you're breathing, which if you're breathing, you have less tension in your body. And that reduction of tension also transfers to the horse. One thing I mention a lot to my students is that your diaphragm, your breathing muscle, is basically a master muscle in your body. If your diaphragm is working in a steady, consistent, soft way, the rest of your body is going to be able to move more smoothly and softer. If you're holding your breath, you're going to have a hard time moving smoothly because the diaphragm's tight, so the rest of your muscles are going to be tight. If you're breathing fast and quick, very shallow, you're also going to have a hard time having smooth, steady motions. So all those things said, it is very important that you keep talking with your animal. If you're familiar with riding, the voice in driving essentially replaces what your seat would be doing, and it can be used to influence your horse in the lightest way possible because it's not a physical aid. Because of your animal's position in front of you and removed from you, the horse can feel like they're kind of the one in charge a little bit more. They're more in a position of leadership, and some of them really enjoy this. A lot of horses, especially those that are more forward and kind of braver, enjoy the freedom that they find in driving. There's less disruption of their personal balance without the extra 100 to 200 pounds or so of person sitting on their back. And so some of them really do enjoy it. But going back to the fact that we're working with animals that live in a herd environment, they're watching the other animals to tell them when there's danger around. It's not just safety in numbers as, somebody else will get eaten first. It's safety in numbers because you've got all these eyes, ears, and noses that are keeping an eye out for danger. So in a steady, stable herd, there's trust that the others are watching your back and making sure that it's safe to be doing what you're doing. You can develop a similar relationship with your equine and get to a point where they trust your judgment. And that is the key part of the react versus respond, because you want them to ask you if they should be worried. This is going to be a little repeat from the most important gait episode, but it's so important and it's worth the repetition. So how do you teach them to respond rather than react? One way is to show them that standing still and stopping is the best thing to do when things get weird. It can start as simple as making a noise, and when they stop moving, the noise stops. You can do this whether standing still, long lining, driving in the carriage, whatever, but you start at a basic point and build from there. So get to a point where if something is making a weird noise, they're going to back off and slow down rather than going faster. Their natural instinct when something weird is happening is to go faster and to try and outrun the scary thing. However, if you're pulling something, it probably makes its own noise, and if you're going faster as you pull it, it's going to make even more noise. So the noise makes it scarier for them, and the animal gets sucked into a cycle of fear that makes them keep going and gets them in worse and worse trouble. So, they jump forward, the vehicle rattles, or you hit a pothole and it makes a noise, and then they take off and it's making even more noise. So showing them in a safe environment that the noise and problems stop when they stop is an essential part of driving training. You can teach this using positive reinforcement. When they slow down, you mark that moment and reward. And again, I can't emphasize how important teaching this to your animal is. You really do want them looking to you for what to do when something scary is happening, or when something that they think is scary is happening. So if something weird is going on and they seem to kind of turn to you with, whether it's looking back or turning their ears towards you, looking to you for answers of what to do, good. If they're checking in with you, great. Then you can tell them what to do and you're going to move forward into a better space. So with some of our larger animals that we drive especially, we don't want them to decide it's every man for themselves. Large herbivores are not the best decision makers in a crisis. So what are other ways that you teach an animal to be responsive rather than reactive? The previous section covered one way, and part of the trick is keeping the curious and thinking side of the brain engaged while you're training. Training techniques that strongly discourage any input from the animal, that punish deviations rather than rewarding an effort and try, can put animals in a state of shutdown. Going back to talking about the 3 responses to fear, the freeze response isn't just about standing still and not moving. It can be also the animal shutting down mentally. When they get into the state of being shut down, they're actually past the fear response, and you might even call them disassociated from what's going on in their environment. So if you come across an animal that's been trained into a state of shutdown, you need to remember that if you try to work past that stage, things might get ugly for a little bit. Because as an animal comes out of shutdown, it's suddenly feeling the environment again, and that can be very overwhelming for them. They've been in a state where they've been past the point of fear, and they've ignored their fear, and as you bring them out of that shutdown stage, they now have to learn how to deal with it and work through it. This can be very overwhelming for some people, and it can result in some undesirable behaviors on the animal's part for a time until it learns how to productively work through stressful situations. If you have the time and patience to work an animal through being shut down and into a more open and receptive state of being, great, but it isn't for everyone. So I guess in conclusion, we want our animals to be responsive to what we ask them to do and not simply reactive. We also want them aware and curious of their environment instead of simply reacting in an instinctive manner to things that are happening around them. I hope you enjoyed this and learned something new. If you have questions or comments, you can reach me at easyintheharness@gmail.com. If you wish to support this podcast and other educational content, please go to our Patreon at patreon.com/certhorsemanship. That's CERT horsemanship. It will also be linked in the show notes. Being a supporting member gives you early access to the podcast episodes and transcripts. Higher levels of support give you access to videos, diagrams, and more that I have to offer, covering subjects from harness fit and function, vehicle selection, maintenance, and training your horse to drive, as well as more. This episode was produced by Amaris Saldate. And remember, you have freedom when you are easy in your harness.